And so we had just mentioned Erikson, but had not really gone to any detail about his theory. He's also in the psychoanalytic tradition. We talked about Freud and finished talking about Freud, so they're both under the umbrella of psychoanalytic theories. But he has more of a psychosocial approach to development. He has some parallel stages to Freud's, but he reframes the issues. The stages in his theory build on one another, and they're always situated in a social context. And for him, the culture provides interpretive tools. So practices may change from one culture to the next, and whatever is adaptational in one culture and works for it actually helps its development. And so for him, he is very much open to the idea of differences in development based on culture as well. And so he has 8 stages. It starts with 0 to 1. This is where little toprak is, basic trust versus mistrust. And so with responsive, consistent care, the infant builds a trust. So their challenge is to basically establish basic trust, right? In the second stage, we have autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy, because what is happening between 1 and 3 years? They start walking, infants. They become toddlers. They start talking. They start exerting more control over the environment, right? Now, this is usually a time when parents, if it's their first child especially, are shocked. Because before, the problem was, is the baby fed? Is the diaper clean? Does the baby have gas? Does the baby want stimulation? Right? Fun and games. But then, now, when infants become able to walk, then their world all of a sudden becomes larger. So the parent starts running after the child to try to prevent the child from getting into trouble unknowingly. The child, though, is exercising autonomy, right? And not only by walking, obviously, but you will see, for example, in 3 years of age, children will all of a sudden start saying, I can do this myself, when you full well know they can't. For example, the child cannot put on their shoes by themselves, but they will start saying, Dad, I can do it myself, stop helping me. And then you wait patiently for 20 minutes where your child tries to put on one shoe. This, though, is again a healthy part of development because the child is exerting control and autonomy over what they can do. Later, the challenge becomes initiative. And if it fails, the child feels guilty. And so this is acting grown-up, thinking about the future, accepting responsibility, not infringing on others, right? Sharing, cooperation, these are the challenges. When the child hits primary school year, starts going to formalized schooling, industry versus inferiority. They start comparing themselves. Can I do things as expected of me? Will I fail? Will I be as successful as my friends? Later, we have identity versus role confusion. We are entering adolescence slowly. These are key crossroads. Who am I in the society of my peers? Who do I want to be? Then comes, is this where you guys are? Intimacy versus isolation. Love and companionship. I hear there's a very good talk coming up, right? Of Emre Hoca, romantic relationships. So, will I be loved by a partner, right? Well, am I worthy of that kind of love? Not only of lovers or spouses, but also of friends, early adulthood. I guess this is where I am. Generativity versus stagnation. I mean, you may want to think I'm here, but no, I'm around here. Am I productive? Am I writing my articles? Could be work, family. It could also be, having children, starting a family. It doesn't have to be about writing articles. It rarely is for the the population. And then ego integrity versus despair. If you find me teaching here 30 years later, I'm going to tell you about this in depth. This is looking back, what have I done in life, basically, and coming to terms with both my successes and my failures. And so as you can see, Erikson's stages are much more comprehensive. It includes all of life stages. And you don't get stuck in a stage with Erikson. So if I, for example, fail here, things didn't go my way, it's not that I don't get to face this challenge. I may resolve this and have a problem here too. I can go back and resolve it through hard work, therapy, and support, but I can. Okay, so there are the behaviorists now. We talked about Freud, and we also know about behaviorists too from your earlier Psych 100 classes. These was inspired by Pavlov's studies of classical conditioning. Can classical conditioning be applied to children's behavior? Do you remember little Albert? You do? Well, I have two videos, little Albert and Bandura, both of which I think you might have watched. But I would like to go back to Albert because it's a little bit more striking. I also will talk about, again, when we talk ethics. That's why I want Albert a little bit. So this is going to be the only video I show in this lecture.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
So, of course, it was a successful experiment in the case that they were able to show conditioning, correct? And conditioning that actually generalized to other objects that were similar. However, it also gave a bad name to developmental psychology, because now people still think that we do nasty things to children in the lab, whereas we've come a very long way, correct? We apply for ethics approvals, we will talk about in chapter 2. Especially when it comes to developmental psychology, the ethics is much sterner than studies that are done with adult participants such as yourself. We have to get approvals from both the mother and the father of the child, and we have to get an approval from the child, and if the child says, I don't want to do this, we stop. And so a lot has changed. We can no longer put on masks and try to scare little children in the lab. But still, when the psychology labs were being built, the security guards at the psychology building were telling me, oh, hocam, I saw your lab. There's a window. Do you give electricity to your participants? No, I said, we don't give electricity. No electric shocks. Yes. Anyways, Skinner later also showed operant conditioning was possible. So behavior can be increased through reinforcement and decreased through punishment. And this basically affected also, he had these big ideas about how the environment, the existence of certain stimuli, the frequency of it, could actually result in both behavioral and developmental outcomes. But after that, we have Bandura, and there's his Bobo doll, who told us that children can also learn through modeling, through watching others. These days, contemporary research is also looking at what? It's looking at how children select what to learn. Because in these past 20 years, we become more and more aware that even 3-year-olds make decisions about whom to learn from, what to learn, what to imitate. And so what are their choosing mechanisms? What are the strategies that they employ? How does it change from one age group to the next? Are the questions that we have been asking recently. And there's some research in our lab about this too. And there comes, yes, my favorite person. Yes, Jean Piaget. And I think this is his one fun picture. Other pictures aren't fun at all. He revolutionized our thinking of children. He did start cognitive developmental psychology. Even if we don't agree with everything that he has proposed, he actually did start cognitive developmental psychology in a way. He never claimed himself to be a child psychologist. And so this is sometimes a title that others give to him. His aim and purpose in his research was different. He wanted to understand where knowledge comes from. He wanted to understand how knowledge emerges in the developing organisms and how organisms start with very basic forms of knowledge, action-based knowledge, and move on to more complicated abstract ideas. So that was his main research question. And so he proposed 4 stages: sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete, and formal operational. These age ranges are really not important for him. Contributions of Piaget. Well, he basically brought the idea. There were forms of this idea in previous literature as well. Children are active learners. And this idea of active learning influenced educational practice and policy. You see all of these colleges that are making these promotions, right? So in 3 months, we're going to start seeing banners everywhere. This koleji öğrenci almaya başladı, right? They're starting to get students, enrollment begins, we're going to give your child a test. And they advertise themselves as hands-on learning, active learning, right? Small group learning. These ideas are all coming from Piaget's ideas that the child is not a passive recipient of knowledge, but an active learner. Yes. And so the question, though, that many people ask is whether he underestimated the competencies of the infants, what infants are born with and what they can do at very early stages of development, such as 3 months of age, 6 months of age. Did he underestimate them? We will talk about this at length in chapter 6 and also before. In the 80s and early 90s, information processing theories were dominant, and they're still around, and we have learned a lot through them. This was a time when computers were becoming prevalent everywhere. And so they basically mapped how we constructed computers, thinking mechanisms, to how we may be thinking or reasoning about problems. So it's basically the idea that the human mind might also be viewed as a symbol manipulating system, much like a computer, through which information flows. So they created these flowcharts where they identified mental processes. And so their studies are very systematic in a way, but there are criticisms of it too. What are in these boxes? Are these boxes interacting with one another? And so on and so forth. We'll get to that. This is chapter 7 in your book. This is, for example, an information processing flowchart showing how the child is given, and this is from your book, how the child is basically given the task of building a bridge. And she has these blocks, and here's a carpet, and in the carpet you see there is this area that says this is a lake. So you can't build on the lake, you need to build a bridge that connects the two sides of the lake. And so the child is basically trying to figure this out. And through these stages and feedback, so of course, when the child puts these two blocks like this, they're going to fall, right? Because there's nothing that holds them. And so at the end, the child will understand how to make those two blocks stand horizontal and parallel to the water. But it basically, by stepwise progression, tells us how the child attacks this problem and overcomes the challenge. The strength of the system, I already mentioned it, is that it's very careful. It's a systematic study of developing abilities. At times it's not cohesive because everybody is kind of interested in one specific ability and then they make flowcharts according to it, but it doesn't come, the literature doesn't come together very well. And some abilities don't fit in boxes. Oh, developmental cognitive neuroscience. This has been emerging fast in the past 15 years, and it is going to become even bigger in the future. This brings together researchers from psychology, biology, neuroscience, and medicine to study the relationship between brain and children's developing cognitive processing abilities and their behavior patterns, especially of importance. Now, the first wave of research also emphasized how the atypical mind actually works. It's very interesting. But now there's recently more and more research also done with typically developing infants and children. Also, of course, one of the challenges of this research is to find, testing children is very difficult because children are very fussy participants. You know, with an adult participant, you say sit, do, and they do it for GE credits. With children, who cares? They will do the task as long as they're happy, which is a problem. Especially when you want them to be uncomfortable, to wear a headset. You know, for those things are a little bit more difficult. But with the development of less and less intrusive technology, it is becoming more and more possible to do this kind of research with both typical and atypically developing children. Theories that focus on the impact of context on development. Context is a key and important word. We talked about context now twice. There's ethology, which is concerned with adaptive value of behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Yes, is there anybody here taking Mind and Evolution this semester? Very nice. You'll tell us all about it. And so it is also, of course, concerned with critical period and sensitive period. And we talked about what these are, and you can reason about why they are important for this type of research, right? And so Konrad Lorenz, the gentleman we saw with the geese following him, and Nico Tinbergen are pioneers. Here it is basically argued that human development includes more sensitive periods than critical periods, but it's important for us to understand why certain types of behavior, certain types of thinking prevailed in evolution. How did they help the organism then? How are they adaptive now? Are they adaptive now? Are questions that are being asked. I'm not going to go over sensitive period again because we already talked about it. So evolutionary developmental psychology seeks to understand the adaptive value of human competencies. It studies cognitive, emotional, and social competencies and how they change with age. Looks at the role of learning, what behaviors are no longer adaptive. It looks at such as risk-taking, for example. Who are big risk takers in development? Who takes more risks? Children, parents. Having a child is a risk-taking behavior. It was a good answer. Adolescents. Risky experimentation with drugs, risky sexual behavior. All that rebellious behavior that makes adolescents so cool when they're adolescents is actually risky behavior, for example. And at one point in time, it had survival value. Does it still have survival value? Is it still adaptive? Are questions that they considered. And they are looking at the complete organism and also environment system. So it's a very holistic view. Another one of these theories that focus on the impact of context is Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. If you take 350 with me next semester, I have a whole week on Vygotsky where I talk for 3 hours. So obviously I have a lot to say, and I'm going to say very little. So according to Vygotsky, children are born into a culture. Now you might ask, how is this different? Don't everybody know that children are born into cultures? Well, he says that the culture is constitutive of who the child later becomes. Through social interaction, through interaction with the culture, child internalizes psychological tools that are present in his environment and adapts them as learning tools. And so thinking, according to Vygotsky, is a socially mediated constructive process. What language you learn, how that language thinks or reasons or expresses about things is very important for Vygotsky, for example. Sure. I'm trying to figure out which part you like repeated. The child, for example, according to Vygotsky, learning language, drastically changes how a child thinks. Okay? Before language, for example, there is thought without language. It's not like all thought has to rely on language. But having language gives you the ability to reason at certain abstract levels more easier. Okay? And so, according to him, when the child is born into a culture, and that culture teaches the child a language, that language actually becomes a psychological tool that is internalized by the child and later used to reason and solve problems. Urie Bronfenbrenner argued for the ecological systems theory, and here he argued that child develops within complex systems of relationships. So he said we can't just look at the child is embedded within systems. So the child is embedded within a microsystem, which is in a mesosystem, an exosystem, and a macrosystem. An environment is ever changing, and he has another system called the chronosystem, where there are bidirectional relationships between the child and the environment and between different levels of the environment. This is a nice depiction of what he means. So the child has individual systems, but then there's the mesosystem, right, where child interacts with each one of these and they interact with one another. But these are embedded within a larger system such as extended family, friends and neighbors, workplace, community health services. The child may not actively interact with any of these, but are affected by them, right? The child might be affected by the parent's workplace. How can parents' workplace affect a child? For example, the policies regarding maternity leave can affect a child, correct? Whether that workplace has a preschool, whether it's free, whether it's subsidized, what the hours are, right? All of these can affect the child, although child does not interact with the workplace directly. And then the macro systems, such as the values, the customs, the laws of the country they're in. And the chronos system is basically this as it's changing in time. Think of yourself, you're born in Turkey, 97. Yes. I wasn't going to 97. This is a rude slap in the face for me. 1997. And your parents. When was your mother born? 1965. Right? So what changed? Even the macro system, some of the values have been tweaked a little bit. Some of the laws have changed. Some of the customs may have changed to, not drastically, customs don't change from one year to the next, but they actually from one generation to the next might become a little bit different. And so the chronos system is also part of Urie Bronfenbrenner's theory. And last, Dynamical Systems theory. This is in chapter 6 and 7, I believe, 6 or 7. This is pioneered by Esther Tellin and others. And this is basically influenced by mathematical and physics models. And it basically tells us that no ability develops alone. All abilities interact with one another. And even the seemingly simplest abilities might actually be depending on several different abilities. So here, it's asking how do systems become organized to function smoothly? For example, what is involved in young children's grasping of moving objects? So if this were moving before me, and if I were an infant, how do I grasp it? So if this was a car rolling down, for example, and one day it is going to happen to him, maybe it's already happening with little Toprak. So if something is moving, how accurate is his grasping as if he wants to take a hold of it? He needs to do several things. Is it only about the arm? No. Is it only about the hand? No. It's also tracking, eye tracking, right? Can he track the moving object? What if we made one of these systems, one of these abilities, a little bit easier on the child? For example, grasping, they have used what they call sticky mittens. So you know how it's difficult for, so this is called fine motor development, right? When the babies and young children start learning how to use their fingers with finesse. And so we know that when you're trying to grasp something, it is very important that these fingers do their job, right, and the palm. So what they did do is with very young infants who weren't able to grasp yet, and I'm not talking about this. This is a reflex that infants do from birth. They basically put sticky mittens, sticky gloves on children's hands. So it had Velcro on them, and so when things, and there were other toys that also had Velcro on them, so it could stick. So they looked to see if infants were reaching and interacting with these objects, and they were doing so at earlier ages because the burden of grasping was taken out of the equation because they were wearing these sticky gloves. It's interesting. So it's telling us that all of these abilities, all of these systems interact with one another to produce outcomes. And if you were to play with one variable to make it easier, you might see changes in the others, right? So it's basically telling us that we should look at no ability in isolation, but think of how they might be related in development as well. Okay, I talked about all of these things. And this is a very nice depiction. As I said, we are going to talk more about dynamical systems theory, so this is just a teaser for it. Now, comparing developmental theories, this is from your book. It is, I should have put the figure. Would it be possible for you to basically take a note so that I put the figure number here too and page number? So this is in your book, but also here in the slides. So it is basically telling you what each theory takes, what the kind of stance each theory takes on each of these questions, whether it's continuous or discontinuous development, whether there's one course of development or many courses of development, or whether nature versus nurture is playing a bigger role in developmental outcomes. Yes. And so I am going to end the class here, because after this is chapter 2. So we are meeting Monday at 9. If you come in late, arkadaşlar, if you come in late to this class, do not knock on the door. Because you see my situation, microphone, Emre Bey. I don't want to yell out buyurun, okay? So quietly come in.